me know when you're ready to start.
Right. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Excellencies, wherever you may be. The Honourable Minister Chet Green, the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Antigua and Barbuda, Ambassador Walton Webson, who's the permanent rep to the UN and chair of OASIS, Assistant Secretary General Elliot Harris from EDESA, distinguished speakers, guests, Commonwealth friends, and colleagues. It is wonderful to be able to be with you, albeit in this terrible COVID period, we are still obliged to do it virtually. And it's good, though, to have this opportunity to connect with you as countries gather at the UN this week to consider the progress on the Agenda for Sustainable Development and continuing need to accelerate action towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. We at the Commonwealth Secretariat welcome this opportunity in conjunction with the government of Antigua and Barbuda and within the broader consideration of inclusive and sustainable development to maintain focus and momentum on the particular value of vulnerability indices and how for SIDS, their use can help to unlock access to additional or more appropriate sources of development financing. Since the 2015 discussions on financing for development in Addis Ababa, there has been growing global recognition of the vital importance of development financing for achieving the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda and also of maintaining ODA as a key element in the financing mix. Whilst more can undoubtedly be done to mobilize greater resources domestically and also through options such as blended green and blue financing, the inherent susceptibility of SIDS to shocks renders these options considerably less feasible or accessible in reality than may appear on paper, as indeed we've seen all too clearly over the past decade. Now, in order to finance the development, SIDS have therefore resorted to loans causing debt, often at high premiums and sometimes at risk of debt repudiation, thereby tending to compound existing vulnerabilities. Even for those SIDS without access to borrowing on capital markets, the increased frequency of shocks and severity, particularly of natural disasters, has made concessional debt more burdensome, crowding out the financing for development. And if we needed a reminder of that, just look at what is happening in the Caribbean right now in terms of hurricanes, floods, and climate difficulties. Truly viable and sustainable options remain few, and indeed far between. And calls for there to be greater leniency in recognition of the vulnerabilities of SIDS seems very largely to go unheard or unheeded. For example, even as SIDS economies were collapsing, calls to the G20 for the DSSI to be extended, and more recently for the Common Framework for Debt Treatments Initiative to be extended to all SIDS, have generally not elicited positive responses, which, if I may say so, is quite extraordinary, given the real anxiety and concern there is in terms of the existential threat that these matters pose to our SIDS. The same can be said, by and large, of proposals for vulnerability indices to be used in connection with development financing, although there have occasionally been positive murmurings. There seems also to be a great reluctance to address the vulnerabilities which so clearly undermine the resilience and growth of SIDS economies and are severely hampering the prospect of their being able to achieve the SDGs by 2030. By developing the Commonwealth Universal Vulnerability Index, our intention at the Commonwealth Secretariat has been to put forward a practical and appealing option for overcoming such resistance and reluctance, and to assist SIDS by offering an appropriate and technically sound tool, which we hope might be acceptable more widely internationally and multilaterally. There are suggestions that a plethora of vulnerability indices is creating confusion, or that they cannot easily be included within mechanisms and criteria for assessing eligibility for financing. With our Commonwealth UVI, we seek to overcome such objections by providing a mechanism for synthesis and unification. And we really look forward to continuing discussions on this. However, our intention for this conversation today is for it to be about more than simply our own UVI or about which index is best. Rather, we hope to raise awareness that even with continuing resistance to SIDS calls for greater assistance and to the adoption of eligibility criteria or an index which captures vulnerability, such indices are informally already being used in practice. In view of this, with your distinguished participation today, we would like to consider the practical utilization of vulnerability indices and how we might carry forward wider conversations on vulnerability in development financing, in particular through the development of multi-dimensional vulnerability indices. Indeed, if vulnerability indices can be of value in assessing eligibility and allocation of development financing, then there would seem to be a need for agreement as to the universal vulnerability criteria. Being able to access funding windows because vulnerabilities have been appropriately gauged and recognized delivers benefits both for SIDS and multilaterally, as inclusive progress towards achieving the SDGs becomes more practicable. Whilst development banks and IFIs may, of course, simply adopt a vulnerability index of their own choice, our view would be that for the sake of transparency, this ought to be done formally rather than informally. It is on such topics and considerations as these that we are keen to hear your views. And I'd like in particular to hear from governments and IFIs as to why there seems to be a general preference to consult vulnerability indices only informally, especially when vulnerability is such a vital factor in the future growth trajectories of small states. So we are fortunate to have two such distinguished speakers to provide the basis of what I am sure will be a vibrant and stimulating discussion. So in thanking them for doing so, can I also take this opportunity to thank each and every one of you for joining us to consider these increasingly urgent and important topics, which are of such pressing and practical import for SIDS and therefore for us all. And so I'm now going to hand it over to our wonderful speakers. So over to you.
Alert audio now unmuted.
Thank you very much, Baroness. Let me begin by, first of all, thanking you. This is tremendous
Alert on the left there,
coming
right there.
together. As you know, we have been working at the United Nations as AOSIS and spearheaded by Antigua and Barbuda to get more attention to this very important subject. So it's a real delight that we have with us you who have given up your day to be with us, because you've been at the first of the HLPF sessions on SIDS. Today is SIDS Day, and we are very grateful that you've given up so much of your time. Minister Paul Chet Green, Foreign Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Minister of Immigration and Trade. And Minister Green, I know is having a little delay in getting on. So before I call him, I will introduce maybe Mr. Harris, but I'll get back to that in a second. We have on the Secretary Elliot Harris, who has been another major player in this process, and have been working with us, with DESA, with OHRLLS, and with the SIDS. And we have others who would contribute to this, Mr. Stewart, and we look forward to a very stimulating, but more importantly, a discussion that will be further drilling down. I think we heard today how much action is needed as we are building consensus. I also want to recognize my own colleague who is in London, my High Commissioner. I saw her come online earlier, and I would love to welcome her and to let her know that we are delighted she is with us. And I hope that she would first feel free to join us later in the process. So I will begin by also acknowledging all of the excellencies from the many SIDS and other members of AOSIS who are here online, and to acknowledge the participation and to encourage them to use the usual process for connecting. And I will, the raise hand signal, etc. I will come back to that once we have heard. I think Minister Green, who I would have introduced to speak now, it might be having a slight delay to get on. So I will introduce Mr. Harris first, and I will let him start, and then I would come back to the Honorable Minister. And this is Mr. And the reason is Minister Green, as I said earlier, had also given up his entire day since 8 o'clock this morning to be with us. And we truly appreciate that. So we give him a breather, as I know that I spoke to him. And in fact, he was calling me since I've been speaking to you, maybe to tell me he's on, but I am going to introduce Elliot Harris, who on our keynote, and he will share, he would speak, and then I would go back and have Minister Green make his statement, and then I will move forward to the other discussion, to the other presentation, and then we'll open up for discussions. So if that's okay, I will now proceed and ask USJ Harris to take the floor and make his presentation. Mr. Harris, you have the floor, please.
I think Mr. Harris is on mute.
I find myself being
Elliot, I
obliged
think you're
to.
muted.
I think I'm online now. 18
Yes,
months of doing
yes.
this every day, and I still haven't learned.
I
I wanted
you
to
saying
say
that yesterday.
you see, case in point. Excellencies, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you on this topic that's becoming increasingly important as we move closer and closer towards the deadline for reaching the SDGs. There is no doubt in my mind that developing countries are subject to a whole range of vulnerabilities that affect the pace and the quality of their economic development. I like to think of these vulnerabilities as being in three sets. One set includes a narrow economic base, dependency on commodity exports and imports of food, fuel, essential inputs, exposure to amplified effects of the global business cycle, geographic location, for example, distance from major markets or being landlocked, and now, of course, increasingly, climate change, biodiversity loss. The second set of vulnerabilities is tied to the problem of relatively weak fiscal systems, informality in the economic structures, financial systems that are underdeveloped and do not provide the financial resources needed for the necessary investments. The third critical vulnerability is the often small size of domestic markets. And this constraint does not only apply to the small island developing states. It applies to countries with very large territories, but small populations. Now, the answers to the first set of responsibilities lie in development itself, in the investments needed to diversify economic structures and reduce those dependencies and exposure to external shocks. But the availability of domestic resources to fund those critical investments is constrained by the second and the third sets of vulnerabilities: the weak fiscal systems, the underdeveloped financial markets, informal structures, and small size of markets. And that is why external finance is so important. And this leads us back to the issue now before us today. Should vulnerability determine access to finance? In order to answer that question, I would like to distinguish between public external finance and private external finance. And let's start with the latter. Private finance is all about risk and return. The first and the second sets of vulnerabilities certainly do affect the perceived risk of an investment in these countries. But not all developing countries face these constraints to the same extent, nor does each of these vulnerabilities affect risk and return in the same way. And I think it's important here to look at both risk and return, because although the risks may seem higher, so too should the potential returns. The third set of vulnerabilities, small size, is another binding constraint for private investment. If an investment doesn't reach a certain minimum size, it is simply not attractive to the international investors. The only short-term answer to this constraint lies in pooling, in consolidation of investment projects, including possibly across different jurisdictions, in order to reach that critical minimum size. Discussing all that goes into this goes a bit beyond the scope of these remarks, so I'll leave it there. So with private finance being constrained by the perceived risk and by the small size, this is where public finance is expected to come in, providing access to resources where access to private resources, domestic or external, is either not possible or it's too expensive. But of course, public development finance is limited, and that is why it must be limited to those countries thought to be most in need, and increasingly thought to be most capable of using it well. No one disputes that. And I think at this stage, the dispute is around two issues. Should vulnerability determine that access? And how should the public finance resources that are made available best be used? The concept note for this event sets out the fact that the gross national income per capita is still being used as an eligibility criterion, despite the availability of vulnerability indices and all the information they contain that should be valuable to allocation decisions. Why is this the case? Well, in my view, one reason is that GNI per capita criterion is a very simple and very comparable measure used primarily to set up a cutoff threshold. It is not intended to focus attention on existing vulnerabilities, nor does it try to do that. It serves to ration the limited funds available to those countries considered unable to access other sources of finance. It is not used to inform allocations within the threshold, nor was it ever intended to. The argument is often made that the per capita income threshold is arbitrary and that it ignores the vulnerabilities that continue to afflict countries even above that income threshold. Of course it does. It wasn't designed to do anything else. Strong arguments can be made, must be made, for using the degree of vulnerability as a criterion for access to official financing rather than instead of the per capita income. I think we all can agree on that. But the argument is much less potent if it is used to justify access to concessional finance. And that is, in fact, what we often talk about when we talk about using vulnerability indices. Because the real function then, and this is a problem, it's a problem because then the function of GNI as the GNI-based indicator to ration the limited available funds is set aside. Now, one of the problems of external financing in middle-income countries is the level of debt involved, and the cost of finance is the other. Debt sustainability is a complex concept, and appropriate debt management needs to take into account a range of factors that we can't go into here. But the other problem is a high cost of finance to middle-income countries, developing countries more generally, much of which is due to this perceived level of high risk. It's often perceived to be high in an unjustifiable way. And that is due to the fact that not enough analysis is done of the individual circumstances of countries. And that might just be the most valuable use of a vulnerability index, to enable a differentiated and well-founded analysis of the actual risk of investing in or lending to a country and how that risk is changing over time. That change would be a function of the overall process of development itself, as well as a function of specific policies. Please note, this is very different from the project-specific risk, but it is the country risk that is often the deciding factor on the overall size of the risk premium that makes these funds more expensive. The vulnerability analysis might also allow policymakers to make more rational use of the external public finance that is available. It may not always be the best use of such limited resources to attempt to de-risk individual projects. And make no mistake, that is what blended finance is about. It might be better to consider how such resources could be used to de-risk the country's investment climate more broadly, through policy improvements, through investments in the enabling infrastructure, through support to the institutions that are needed for a conducive overall environment for inclusive and sustainable growth and development. This use of a vulnerability index could also strengthen the case for the allocation of limited external resources, even if these are not on fully concessional terms, because it overcomes the fallacy that a country, by simple virtue of having graduated out of low-income status, is automatically able to access all the finance needed on appropriate terms elsewhere. It is not. A vulnerability index could and should inform the approach to dealing with a country's unsustainable debt and determining its level of sustainable debt and how that will evolve over time. And this is an aspect of financing that's becoming more urgent with every passing day. And so in concluding, a strong case can be made, must be made, for using vulnerability indices in development finance, but perhaps not only or not even primarily to set eligibility to concessional resources. It would, such an index, make a better assessment of risk and return and of the priorities for improvement possible. And that is something that the providers of official development finance would maybe be more likely to consider. Thank you.
Alert, audio now unmuted.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes, we are hearing you.
Okay. So I think, is Minister Green on?
Yes, I am on, Excellency.
Okay. So, Mr. Harris, thank you so much, Elliot, and we'll come back to you. I'm sure in the question section, your presentations are always very stimulating. I'm now going to turn the floor to the Honorable Minister for his presentation. And then we will, as I said, after that, we will continue with another presentation, then come back to questions. Minister Green, thank you for giving so much of your time today. We know you have been with the SIDS focus program this morning throughout the entire morning and now into the afternoon. So, and we know that you are extremely busy. So we do appreciate the time that you have allocated to the SIDS Day in the ECOSOC HLPF at the United Nations. So thank you very much. And the floor is yours, Minister.
Thank you, Ambassador. Excellencies. For me, it is a delight to share this moment with the esteemed Secretary General of the Commonwealth and other invited guest speakers. I must say from the get-go that the events of today have all been very interesting. The gathering of consensus and a recommitting to the cause of ASIS and to the work of SIDS is indeed a life's work for most of us, and one for which we should not shirk, shy, or deviate away. Excellencies, there are various reasons that could account for the fact that during the last decade or so, a renewed interest has been focused on the concept of vulnerability, how it should be measured, and the absolute need for an index. This interest may have been triggered by highly visible events, such as the socio-political unrest in some parts of the world, global economic crisis, the effects of climate change, and more recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. This renewed interest may also reflect international concern about the structural characteristics of specific groups of countries such as ours, SIDS, as recently mandated by the UN General Secretary or Assembly, Resolution 75/215, which allows or provides to the Secretary General to provide recommendations on the possible creation of a multi-dimensional vulnerability index for SIDS. I want to be absolutely clear in stating that what we're doing here today is not new. The call of it by itself is not new. It dates back almost 30 years. Over 30 years, we've repeatedly expressed concern over a level of vulnerability, as evidenced at the 1994 Barbados Conference on Sustainable Development of Small Island Developing States. The Barbados Plan of Action recommended the development of vulnerability indices and other indicators that reflect the true nature of SIDS and integrate the ecological fragility with economic vulnerability. In 1996, the General Assembly requested that the Secretary General prepare a report on the Vulnerability Index, and a committee for development planning was also established to examine this index. It did not end there, because in 1998, the UN Commission on Sustainable Development pressed the CDP to present its findings and for other UN bodies and agencies to accord priority to the work on vulnerability of SIDS. As recent as 2004, the Mauritius strategy reiterated the concern of the international community about the vulnerability of SIDS. And by 2014, yet another tier of our interventions saw the Samoa pathway, which echoed all of the earlier calls. Excellencies, when developing countries face multiple shocks at once, and more specifically SIDS, there should be mechanisms in place that will facilitate full recovery. While SIDS are recognized as being the most vulnerable countries, many SIDS are locked out of the concessional financing or grants due to the erroneous designation of middle income and high income countries that result in unintended consequences. The reality is that special consideration should be given to an MVI that builds the resilience of SIDS, allows for comprehensive recovery from shocks, and ensure that our countries are able to achieve the SDGs. Fundamentally, we must seek to address the resistance of a more formal use, especially when some regional development banks and some within the UN system are applying the concept of vulnerability informally. Let us not allow another 30 years to pass, or another major global event to disrupt the sustainable development of developing countries, and in particular, the development of SIDS. I'm looking forward with great interest to joining in what I hope will be a very lively discussion this afternoon as we proceed with the discussions, with the evaluations, with the reviews, but most importantly, the projections of the interests of SIDS at the international level. There are very few global events that has the potential to change the manner in which we operate as a community. And the pandemic, COVID-19, is one such. As I said earlier, in 1992, the Barbados Plan of Action provided the then blueprint for small island developing states. It also provided a call to action in addressing the unique vulnerability of SIDS. Almost 30 years on, the Barbados Plan of Action drove the notion of the need to take into account certain vulnerabilities when considering development aid and aid utilization. Throughout the last 30 years, SIDS continue to face many developmental challenges. These challenges are based primarily on our vulnerability to climate change, economic and external shocks. It was only a few days ago, Excellencies, that the world marked 4 million deaths as a result of the unrelenting COVID-19 pandemic. A pandemic that has thrown the world into chaos with its multidimensional ripples. At the heart of this chaos are the most affected, our small island developing states. The pandemic, which started as a threat to human and global health, has morphed into a global economic turmoil with an increase, visible and noticeable increase in the inequality amongst the poorest, and has laid bare the very foundations of ineffective global policy and coordination. The smallest and weakest of us are seemingly left to our own devices to fend for ourselves during this pandemic period. International accords such as the 2030 Agenda and the Samoa Pathway are what we turn to and rely on to gain particular focus on SIDS. The international community agreed that we represent special case for sustainable development, and therefore the necessary assistance should be provided to ensure survival or resilience and a more sustained and sustainable development. The adoption of these goals were taken seriously by SIDS, and they are taken seriously by SIDS. And for us, these goals can no longer be seen as aspirational. They must be supported as being achievable. The pandemic and the associated socioeconomic crisis lay bare the urgency of our times. We cannot, and I repeat, we cannot be seen to be simply and solely in survival mode. Multilateralism and securing the support of the international community is most critical at this stage, lest we SIDS find ourselves swept into oblivion. Excellencies, SIDS have always been inherently susceptible to external economic and financial shocks. We are small, we're remote, we have a narrow resource base, and we exhibit a very high reliance on imports, high levels of public debt, and challenging economic growth prospects. The COVID-19 pandemic poses both immediate economic and financial challenges to our small states and has caused and continues to cause great social and societal dislocations. For small, vulnerable economies, these challenges will persist well beyond recovery. Because as I said this morning in an earlier forum, the recovery from this pandemic is not a night and day scenario. As small states, we are faced with the enormous pressures of saving lives and safeguarding livelihoods within very limited fiscal space. It was for those very reasons that immediately at the start of the pandemic, our countries led the call for effective global intervention to stave off the pressures on our health and social systems and to prevent economic collapse. We produced a statement on debt. We convened numerous meetings. We commissioned studies, and we fervently asked international financial institutions to provide tailored relief to our vulnerable countries. While the IFIs heard our calls, it is a truism to state that very little action has taken place. As many have held the view and the notion that once SIDS have graduated to middle and high income countries, we need not be provided with concessional financing or grants in order to recover from the pandemic. As the AOSIS has stated on many occasions, our actions now should be, must be, ought to be on avoiding a lost decade. A lost decade that will foreclose any hope of delivering on the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, including achieving our SDGs, or commitment made under the Paris Climate Agreement, or even to the Samoa Pathway. Whilst no one can yet predict whether COVID itself or the damage to economies and livelihoods due to the lack of comprehensive tailored policy response will provide the lessons for future multilateral responses, we do know that doing nothing is just not acceptable. We must take bold actions that will finally break the failed policy prescriptions that have been foisted upon us. It is in this light and on this basis that AOSIS will continue to call for the creation of a multidimensional vulnerability index that takes into account the unique circumstances, the real circumstances, the prevailing circumstances of our existence. We have been making this call, as I said, for almost 30 years. I implore us to now move past the rhetoric and to find lasting solutions that will comprehensively, effectively, and finally address the vulnerabilities of SIDS. And let's come together to help SIDS to get on a path of realizing real development or commitment to the SDGs included. Mr. Chairman, if it pleases you, I thank you.
Alert, audio now unmuted.
Thank you, Minister Green. And if you're able, we will appreciate if you stayed around for the question and answer section. I also once again want to thank Assistant Secretary General Harris for his presentation previously. And as Mr. Harris, you too, if I'm sure, will stay around for questions as well. We will now have a presentation. I think it's a PowerPoint presentation by Dr. Stuart Davies, who is with the regional office for Barbados and the OECS back in the Caribbean. And Dr. Davis, it's over to you, please.
Thank you. I'm just about to share my screen, so bear with me, please. Okay, can you all see that and hear me?
Alert, audio now unmuted.
Yes, Stuart, go ahead, please. It's clear and we can hear you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Ambassador Wedson, and good afternoon, Secretary General Scotland, Minister Green, ASG Harris, Excellencies, and to everyone on this call. I've been asked to introduce the role that vulnerability indices play in development finance and explore their potential wider use. As a development financing arena is quite large, I'm going to focus on how vulnerability indices are used for concessional financing, and at the end put forward some thoughts of how they might be used more widely. I think it's also useful to clarify, as ASG Harris has done, that the information that these indices convey can be interpreted differently by different users. A development practitioner may see these tools as highlighting areas of potential intervention, while from an investor's perspective or financing's perspective, they may signal risk and creditworthiness. My focus is on the former and how the indices can enrich our assessment of development need. Before proceeding, it's still typically the case that, at least formally, traditional income-based measures are used to calibrate development need. And one can see why. Development is complex and heterogeneous process and requires a huge data gathering effort. Using an aggregate measure, income per capita, greatly simplifies things as it is widely available, easy to standardize and straightforward to benchmark. Having said all that, income-based measures are not without their flaws, not least because they focus on flows from a narrow subset of assets that make up a country's total wealth. For SIDS, with their unique set of vulnerabilities, income-based measures can give a false signal of development need, especially if these vulnerabilities affect assets like natural capital that are not or only partially captured in income flows. SIDS also face a double whammy, as when income-based measures are driving reduced financial support in performance-based allocation models, vulnerabilities may actually be on the rise. In the absence of a single agreed measure of vulnerability, we've seen the development of a range of vulnerability indices being used more and more to complement income-based measures. What vulnerability indices bring to the table are a conceptual framework that helps us frame what the index is trying to measure, and a set of weighted indicators, in the most part, that capture vulnerability under this conceptual framework. The output of any index, therefore, results from these two elements, and the effectiveness of any index depends on how closely the conceptual framework represents the vulnerability that's under the spotlight. So it's not necessarily the case that we need a single index, but more to ensure that the index is used appropriately. Horses for courses principle, if you like. Informally, we see vulnerability indices used in a variety of ways. They inform and frame country diagnostics, sector and thematic assessments, strategies and country narratives, theories of change and the structure and focus of programs and policy interventions, as well as influence the direction of resources, inform risk and risk mitigation strategies, and form the basis of further investigations and deep dives. These informal uses of vulnerability carry substantial developmental value, and we shouldn't forget this. Formally, though, the hardwiring of these indices in eligibility and allocation criteria has been fairly slow off the mark. For both eligibility and allocation, income measures still typically are used to govern access to and core levels of concessional finance. On eligibility, per capita income is the sole criteria for ODA and is the predominant eligibility criteria for most concessional funds. It is in the case of least developed country membership where vulnerability criteria has a greater role. So with relatively few exceptions, income-based criteria drives eligibility, and this has important consequences for countries like SIDS, particularly with those with higher incomes. At a glance, of the 48 SIDS identified by UNESCO, 14 are not ODA eligible, 10 of which are located in the Caribbean. For aid allocations, we find a similar story. Income-based measures again dominate needs factors in performance-based allocations for concessional finance, as you can see in the table on this slide. Across a range of allocation models, what we see is that vulnerability only features directly in the Caribbean Development Bank's needs factors formula, and as the next slide will show, indirectly for the Asian Development Bank. So only in as far as vulnerability impacts GNI per capita are SIDS vulnerabilities reflected in the needs factors of these allocation models. And to compound matters, for SIDS, their inherent vulnerabilities may also adversely impact performance factors, causing an additional impact on their allocation shares. Responding to this, there have been several initiatives to increase access to concessional sources of finance through exceptions, new funds, or as already mentioned, Premier added to needs scores to amplify vulnerability needs. Specific examples include the World Bank Small Island Economy Exception, which allows access to concessional finance even if incomes exceed the IDA operational cutoff. Following the global financial crisis, we also saw the European Union operate a variable flex mechanism that provided financial resources to complement loan-based assistance from the World Bank, IMF, and regional development banks. This too was informed by vulnerability criteria. And most recently, the UN Joint SDG Fund has developed a SIDS window focused primarily on building resilience and ending vulnerability, the formulation of which was informed heavily by vulnerability assessments. While the formal take-up of vulnerability indices has been relatively slow, a substantial amount of work has been done to test different options. For the IDA 16 replenishment, several options that included the Economic Vulnerability Index were tested for their impact on countries' allocation shares. Similarly, for the African Development Fund's 14th replenishment, options were tested to capture structural and climatic vulnerabilities into their allocation model. Several challenges were uncovered as a result of this process, which led both organisations to hold off hardwiring these indices into their allocation models. Most notably among these were issues relating to the coincidence, timeliness, cost, and availability of these indexes. There was also potential for double counting through the duplication of variables like population size and the influence structural vulnerabilities already had on per capita incomes, albeit partially. Finally, distributional issues were highlighted in cases where too much volatility may be introduced by these indices, and so undermining the predictability of aid for some beneficiaries. Turning to the question on potential for further formal use, it's very encouraging to see some regional development banks taking steps to incorporate vulnerability into their allocation models, as well as the continuing endeavours of others to find ways to overcome these challenges. Sticking points on eligibility are not just confined to data, but also to finding ways to minimise the potential for permanency bias. That is, where time and aid invariance of some vulnerabilities mean that countries remain eligible for longer periods of time. Also, additional work is needed to determine what graduation thresholds should be set to ensure sustainability when external support is eventually withdrawn. On aid allocations, work also continues to improve the coverage, parsimony, cost effectiveness, stability, and timeliness of indices, as well as enhance structural vulnerability indices that better avoid the introduction of moral hazard to concessional financing. Also promising are recommendations for how other supporting measures to per capita income can be used to enrich our understanding of sustainable development needs. If we consider sustainability as being the flip side of vulnerability, there have been calls to include wealth measures alongside income-based measures. Also, past analysis by the Commonwealth Secretariat of using volatility in per capita income as a proxy for vulnerability could offer another interesting option to complement income per capita. This schematic I've put together on this slide attempts to connect the dots between development need, so low or high per capita income, vulnerability, the volatility in income per capita over time, and resilience building, the reduction in volatility over time, to advance the concept of needs from one that's dependent upon income per capita to sustainable development needs that's underpinned by a broader set of holistic measures. Practically, complementing per capita income with wealth and/or vulnerability measures could be one route by which we can better identify and respond to the country's sustainable development needs. By way of some final thoughts before I wrap up, when we look at the global SDG financing gap, estimated at around $2.5 trillion per annum, ODA flows at around $160 billion per annum fall far short of what is required. Private capital flows are much larger and have the potential to take us from billions to trillions required. Vulnerability indices can play an important role in shaping and setting the direction of new innovative financing mechanisms and solutions by signalling where the development of new financing products are needed for resilience building and sustainability. And for instance, the new climate resilience finance platforms that are developing in this part of the world are very encouraging. Identifying priority areas for results-based financing and debt management are also another area where vulnerability indices can be helpful. And examples here are responsible banking or climate debt swaps. And finally, signalling where to focus technology to improve access as well as the efficiency of finance could also be informed by vulnerability indicators that help us direct technologies to where they're most needed. Of course, with new development finance, we would need an investable, ready pipeline, and vulnerabilities can also support this too. Through a better understanding of countries' sustainable development needs, projects can be identified and developed to mobilize investment. So, to conclude, in this decade of action, notwithstanding the outstanding issues surrounding the use of these indices, these tools certainly have the potential to enhance our understanding and assist with better financial resource targeting for sustainable development outcomes. Time, as always, is of the essence to capitalize and make the best use of the tools we have. I thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davies. Stuart, and I think, Stuart, I don't know if it's possible for you to share that presentation so that we can hand it out. If that were possible, that would be very helpful. I know for me, because as chairing this, I've been moving from left to right, trying to do several things. So if you could, if it were possible, we would love to have it. Is that possible?
Yes, of course.
We appreciate it. Thank you so much. I think maybe if you got it to, well, you know the process, to DESA or some, and they can then get it to me, and my office can send it to everybody from AOSIS involved. So thank you so much. Excellent. Colleagues, Excellencies, we are at a point where we are going to move into the question and answers and section. Let me give you the usual process. I heard the Assistant Secretary saying no matter how often he uses it, he still makes the same error I do. So Assistant Secretary Harris is here to answer questions along with the Baroness, Her Excellency Patricia Scotland, and Minister Green may have stayed with us as well. I know he was not sure. And I think you can even throw the questions up, and even we can invite Stuart to join us. The process is the usual. Raise your hand using the raise hand function, or put your questions in the chat group, and we will acknowledge the question or acknowledge you if you have indicated in the chat group your interest to ask a question. So the floor is now open. I'm going to ask my colleague to just let me know if we're not getting any questions yet. Is that correct, colleagues? Tomasi or Anya or anybody?
But we have Professor Forde Jawad.
Okay. Excellent. Let's start with the professor, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Professor Fode Jawad. I'm the Minister of the Environment in Sierra Leone. And I bring you greetings from His Excellency the President, retired Brigadier Dr. Julius Maada Bio, and the people of Sierra Leone. And I'm saying this because we have a visionary leader who has now created a stand-alone Ministry of the Environment, and I was appointed the minister. Ladies and gentlemen, mine is not a question. I just want to make a brief statement, if I can be permitted, Mr. Chairman. If that is okay, sure. I just have a few comments to make.
No problem, absolutely.
Actually, a question.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking the Commonwealth for organizing this debate on a topic that is so pertinent to Sierra Leone and the global village. It will be critical to take note of the following as to why there is resistance to formal use of vulnerability indices in development financing decisions. Firstly, we need to know and agree on the definitions of vulnerability used in guiding resource allocation decisions. We also need to understand the different contexts of vulnerability across nations and make the analysis clear and available to development financing institutions in forming vulnerability indices. This knowledge is crucial for the DFIs, that is the development financial institutions, because they could be guided by organizational policies drawn from their stakeholders. Thus, any working vulnerability definitions and indices of the DFI policy should be coherent and consistent. For instance, we need to define what is climate change related vulnerability and develop the appropriate vulnerability indices, capturing this context for the attention of DFIs that are especially interested in providing climate change vulnerability related financing. We also may need to define epidemic-related vulnerability and develop the appropriate vulnerability indices, capturing this context for the attention of DFIs that are especially interested in providing epidemic-focused vulnerability-related financing. And we can also clearly define what is meant by weak governance and policy-related vulnerability to develop the appropriate vulnerability index, capturing this context for the attention of DFIs that are especially interested in providing policy, governance, vulnerability-related financing, as the case may be. This menu of vulnerability indices can offer options to DFIs to select the one that is consistent with organizational policy or structural policy, including legal and socio-political framework thereby reducing the risk of presenting resistance to the use of an aggregated, generic, or a prescribed index. Indeed, institutions, including the UN and other multilateral financial institutions, can use aggregated or generic vulnerability indices to inform their decisions, resource mobilization, and resource allocations, given their high level and degree of multilateralism. At the same time, specific indices could also be available to them. Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, let me quickly comment on two vulnerability-related indices that are both considered in informing
Minister,
our policies in Sierra Leone.
Minister, you'll have to wrap up because of other questions. So if you
I'm
could do
wrapping up
that,
now. Okay,
if you
thank
could do that very
Yeah,
quickly.
these are the
we'd
income
appreciate it.
poverty index.
Sorry?
Okay. These are the income poverty index and multidimensional poverty index. And also, we should also ensure that indicators reflect a holistic vulnerability that is not limited to country policy and must be multidimensional. That is covering the three structural factors of vulnerability with a propensity to affect developmental studies in a country. These factors are economic vulnerability to resist external or natural shocks, physical vulnerability like loss of biodiversity due to climate change, and societal vulnerability. Finally, indicators must be simple, understandable, and based on reliable statistics. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot thank more for organizing this thought-provoking debate that I am hopeful will inform a better development financing landscape in the world. I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister, for your very valuable contribution. And we would look forward to continuing this dialogue with your colleagues from Sierra Leone, and hopefully you will be here in New York as we move forward on this. I will now invite His Excellency Felix Ban from
Ambassador, we're not hearing you. Unmute your mic again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I'll make your life easy by pronouncing my name properly. It's Felix Mbayo. Very simple.
Mbayo, indeed.
Mbayo, yes.
Thank you.
Which means simply, he who doesn't take orders easily. Well, that said, Mr. Moderator, permit me to start by thanking the Commonwealth Secretary General for using the convening power of the Commonwealth to focus attention on this very topical issue. I think the COVID-19 epidemic has shown us the importance of factoring in the vulnerability index in most of what we do. I know today this discussion is organized on the Seeds Day, and it is not our intention to detract attention from the particular and peculiar needs of the seeds. We are all in solidarity. That's why my president asked me to take part in this meeting. But to say the issue of vulnerability is of prime importance to most developing countries. And I think those issues pertaining to climate change, to social and economic and political upheavals do apply across the board. Thus, the need for all of us to work hard to make sure that the international financing institutions factor this in their evaluations. My question is this. From what Minister Green said, this issue has been on the agenda for nearly 30 years. We have been talking about it for nearly 30 years. Concretely speaking, what can the Commonwealth do for us to move from talking to action? Because we have heard, even the presentation of Mr. Stuart Davis shows that a lot of studies has gone into the matter. But even then, it is still just an informal index. What do we need to do concretely to make sure that it becomes a formal index? I thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I am now.
So thank you very much, Professor. And I think your question is a very apt question. We have been, and I am very pleased that you asked that question. I'm also very pleased that you noted the focus of this being on SIDS, but your question is very well directed here. And I'm going to ask both Assistant Secretary General Harris as well as Baroness to answer your question before we go to the next speaker. But I think that's part of the challenge, and that's part of where we want to get to. I think we have done a lot of talking, and the Baroness made some reference to that in her presentation. We've done a lot of talking, especially, yes, over the last 20 years, but in the last 18 months, we have spoken a lot about this issue. And I think we need to be answering what we need to do next to move from question to action. So Baroness, you want to give it the first shot, and then Elliot, maybe? The question is, what can the Commonwealth do to move us to that action point?
I think the whole purpose of us having this meeting today is to enable us to examine what that multi-dimensional, multifaceted index needs to look like in order to be the instrument of change. And I was so interested to hear what the minister from Sierra Leone was saying, and indeed what His Excellency has just said, because all of those factors that were highlighted demonstrates the multiplicity and complexity of the issues which have to go into the vulnerability index. And I understand absolutely that ASG Harris is saying, well, this is not necessarily to be focusing on financial or concessional finances. And can I just say why I think perhaps that isn't the whole picture? Because if you look at where we have been, it's an issue in the past which said that GDP indicated a level of fiscal rectitude exercised by an individual state. So the more successful a country was in managing its economy and managing its resources and governing well, the higher the GDP would be. Now we know with SIDS, that's not necessarily true, because SIDS and small states have shown real fiscal rectitude and have been very competent at managing their levels of fiscal issues, and they've been fiscally competent. What they have not been able to do is to deal with the exogenous shocks that come from climate and come from external matters like COVID, like the fact that you may be subject to regional conflict, which was not originated by you. So these external shocks have materially changed the way in which we operate. So I think the reason that we are looking at this comprehensive, multi-dimensional index is to understand the complexity of where we are now today. Gone are the days when people said there was no correlation between climatic crises and incidents and debt. The historical debt has in many ways been created by that. So I think the whole purpose of this meeting is for us to have this interrogation of, so what does the instrument have to look like and what must it do? And our index is truly comprehensive. We're looking at resilience, but we're also looking at vulnerability, and the ability to disaggregate the different aspects of our vulnerability index, I think will make it a very powerful tool. But it's this very conversation that we need to have to say, not what are we going to talk about, what are we going to do? Because we have to do it now. And the reality is that many of our member states are facing an existential threat. And the reason that we think the multi-dimensional vulnerability index is important is it is showing that the least developed countries are the most vulnerable. It is also showing that small states, irrespective of whether they are notionally high income, middle income or low income are also inherently vulnerable. But it's a measure that can help us evaluate all our countries' vulnerability, irrespective of size. So that's the value. And this is why I am so grateful for this conversation, so grateful for everything people are going to say, because whatever we talk about today is going to help us to better hone how we craft the multi-dimensional vulnerability index so it's fit for purpose and it works.
Thank you, Baroness Scotland. Thank you so much, Excellency. Assistant Secretary General Harris, you want to comment on that?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Yes, I do think there are a couple of points I'd like to make. First, let me say up front, I agree with virtually everything the Baroness has just said. I'm not sure I subscribe to the thought that the idea behind the income criterion is a concept of rectitude, fiscal or otherwise. I do subscribe to the notion that the use of that criterion does prevent us from seeing vulnerabilities, and that was what I said in my intervention. And I think the vulnerability index is critical because it allows us to point out what is causing the problems. Yeah? Be it the exposure to shocks of some kind, be it the lack of access to the critical investment. Now, that means that the vulnerability index should have the components necessary to assess these different types of vulnerabilities. In that context, I want to make two remarks. One, as the Baroness said, having multiple indices at the same time does sow confusion. And so it would be helpful if we could start to converge towards an agreement on what a multi-dimensional vulnerability index should have as its basis, what kind of information it should convey. And which particular standard we converge around, well, that remains to be seen, but we should aim for that. The second question, though, is, and we've seen this very clearly in our efforts to measure our progress towards the SDGs, it is that the data involved in collecting the information needed to construct an index is sometimes easy for countries to bring together, is sometimes more difficult for countries to bring together. And so we need to try to have an index that can cover all of the key vulnerabilities in a way that all countries can report, because we need to have something that is sort of a standard, that everybody understands what's behind it. That is the compelling attractiveness of GNI. It is the same thing everywhere you look. We want to have a multi-dimensional vulnerability index that is the same thing everywhere we look, that is comparable across countries, but is also comparable over time. We need to be able to measure progress. And so I think we need to have something that is as light as it can be, without in any way sacrificing the comprehensiveness of that assessment. We need to identify all of the salient vulnerabilities in order to be able to act on them in one way or the other. And as my thesis is, the development finance is one aspect of how we use a multi-dimensional vulnerability index. There are many other ways in which we can use it as well. Thank you.
Can I just say I agree with.
Thank you very much.
Say I agree with Elliot Harris on that.
But before you continue, Baroness, because we're kind of running on time, so let me make a suggestion though. There are some comments and questions in the chat. So maybe if you and the Assistant Secretary could also look at those, and we can then add those to your remarks when I come back to you, because we have one more question, and then I'll have you, if you look at those as well, you can then make some remarks in relationship to the closing comments that Mr. Harris just made, and as well as your own comments to the questions. But I think I like the fact that we are having this kind of dialogue, and because this is where we need to get to. We do need to begin to hone it and close into certain points on this thing, so we could really reach some sort of point that we could begin to talk about next steps in application. So I like that. So if, with all respect, and if you could hold on a little bit, is that okay?
Absolutely.
Thank you so very kindly. So we'll there's a question from Kenya. Would you like, could you take the floor, please?
Excellency, let me thank you for this opportunity. Mine is basically not a question, but I want to make a brief statement.
Okay, but
as I
you
find
will
this,
have, sorry, you will have to be short because we're running on time. And then, as I said, we have some questions.
I'll endeavor to, yeah,
We
I'll
want them
endeavor
to
to be
respond.
short. I thank the Secretary General of Commonwealth and the Permanent Representative of Antigua and Barbuda, the United Nations, for inviting us to this session. The session provides us with a platform for engagement on having international financing institutions and multilateral development banks to consider using multidimensional vulnerability index when considering financial requests from least developed countries, small island developing states, and developing countries. This is a timely policy dialogue coming in the backdrop of the UN consideration of the multidimensional vulnerability index in August 2021. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has re-energized debate over the vulnerability indices in access to concessional financing. Excellencies, allow me to add my voice to this debate by sharing Kenya's experience and response to COVID-19 and linkage with the vulnerability index in developing countries. Kenya, like other countries, was hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. It disrupted economic activity, leading to closure of businesses.
Again, I'm going to have to ask, excuse me, I'm going to have to ask you to be very quick on this because we are running out and the focus is on SIDS at this moment. So I don't want to drift from it because I want Mr. Stewart and Dr. Elliott and others to respond. So you have to be very quick. Or
I will. I just want to reiterate that
you have 1 minute to wrap up.
I just want to reiterate that this discussion is timely and that the indices needs to be considered in providing provision of concessional funding to governments without looking at their income status alone. The discussants have rightly underscored the relevance for formal use of vulnerability indices in developing a financing decision. In this regard, the task before us is to explore and come up with a single agreed vulnerability index or adopt several vulnerability indices that are adopted for specific purposes. Towards this end, development financing should take into consideration the diversity and specific development needs for middle-income countries. Financing policy should be sequenced, gradual, and phased out to address diverse challenges in middle-income countries post-COVID-19, so that it does not fall into the income trap, considering that they are home to over 70% of the world poor.
Thanks.
Excellency, just in conclusion, we thank the multilateral development institutions, among others, for supporting our development aspirations that are actually also supporting us at this critical time of vulnerability. I think
so thank you very much, and I apologize. Thank you very much, and I apologize, but we got to wrap up, and I really apologize. And again, if you wish to share that in the chat or share it to us, we will appreciate it. But we want to try to keep the program focused and moving, and your comments are quite appropriate as we have been hearing, and I thank you. Let me just ask Dr. Stewart and then Dr. Harris, Assistant Secretary General, and then Baroness, and then we would have to close. So Stewart, would you like to either respond to any of the questions or comments you have heard, please?
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Weston. In terms of the use of the multidimensional vulnerability, I think it comes back to what I said in the presentation in terms of, when we think about the ingredients of a multidimensional vulnerability, there's two essentially. There's the indicators and there's a conceptual framework. And I think that the task is to come together to agree on a conceptual framework and a sensible, parsimonious, cost-effective set of indicators that support that. And if we can get that far, then I think we have the workings of an MVI to take forward. The next issue, I think, is the practical one of how can you transition a MVI into performance-based allocation models, if that's the intention, or to eligibility criteria. There are issues there that need to be worked through, and work is ongoing, so it's encouraging that is taking place. But nevertheless, there are some still thorny issues there that need to be addressed before we can actually establish these into core allocation models. The Caribbean Development Bank have done a great job in doing this. They actually have included it into their needs assessment within the performance-based allocation model. The Asian Development Bank have also done very well in terms of thinking innovatively of how they might include a premium that allows the vulnerabilities of Asian Development Bank eligible SIDS to be amplified within their performance-based allocation. It's this kind of thinking, I think, that is what we need going forward in order to make this happen. So that would be my thought with regard to how we could use this index in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I've been just checking with my colleagues on the time. Thank you very much. And I've been checking with my colleagues in the time. So before I go back to Elliot and or Baroness Scotland, I'm just going to ask if anybody else have any comments or questions, but we do have a few extra minutes. And if nobody else, I will ask I will go back to Yanya from Kenya and see if he wanted to just close off because I know I rushed him. So if there's nothing else in the chat, do you want to end with your closing, Kenya?
Let me just thank you for the opportunity, but at this stage, I have nothing else to add.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so Elliot, and would you like to then just close off before we have Baroness, and then we'll go to the other item on the agenda?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I'm going to respond to one of the questions. I tried to answer 2 or 3 of them in the chat box, but one of the questions from Leonard Fleck asked if it's possible to get data that would indicate which countries would receive more if ODA and concessional finance were allocated according to vulnerability indices. And I think that's essentially the problem here. And I don't get tired of saying this. Moving to a vulnerability index on its own isn't going to change the available volume of concessional finance. And then it becomes a question of which of the larger number of concessional countries eligible for concessional finance will get what share of the existing pie. That's hard to determine ahead of time, in part because we won't know for sure where countries rank on the scale of vulnerability. And so we do have to first agree on what the vulnerability index should be, what the basis for comparison should be, and how that then is used to make allocation decisions. And only then will we be able to estimate who might get more and who would get less. But let us please never lose sight of the fact, no matter how much we wish it were otherwise, making countries eligible for concessional finance is just the first step. But the volume of concessional finance is not going to automatically increase because there are more eligible countries. That is an unfortunate, difficult reality that we just simply have to start to face. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I wonder, Elliot, if countries, I know somebody asked the question, which country will get more? I mean, I'm surprised at that question myself, because I'm not sure the issue is about who gets more. The issue is about the vulnerability that you are exposed to, and therefore the need for you to get that assistance. It doesn't matter about more or less. I don't think the pie would grow. I think everybody must know that. I think the question is, there are those who are in need and can't get because of the present definition. So, Baroness, do you want to add to that, or I'll close on anything else?
Well, just to say that there is a question, of course, of volume. And one of the issues that we have globally to wrestle with is what is the appropriate level of assistance we should give, bearing in mind the real changes that are happening in our world today if we are not going to leave anyone behind. Now, we say that as a word. What does it mean unless we're willing to make those decisions which will enable that reality to be delivered? So I'll just say that understanding better the data which targets what the vulnerabilities are, what the risks are, what does that mean for us delivering our sustainable development goals, and to say to our global community, do we really want to achieve those goals because we have some very hard choices to be made. And there's a particular hard choice to be made in relation to the small and the vulnerable member states and the least developed. And so how we deal with that is going to be incredibly important. But to take up the issues that a number of colleagues have raised about the complexity of this issue. I hope that all on this call will have had an opportunity to look at what we in the Commonwealth Secretariat have tried to do in terms of creating this multi-dimensional vulnerability index, which we call the Universal Vulnerability Index, because things have changed so rapidly and we need more flexibility. And we're not attached to our model, but what our model tries to do is to bring together all the different elements so that we've got a sort of one-stop shop. And this conversation has been incredibly helpful because it enables us to hone even further what that model may look like, because it's quite clear that all of us want a multifaceted, multidimensional vulnerability index. And now, as Elliot and I think Stuart have been saying, we have to decide what are the criteria going to look like and how are we going to be able to use it. And Ruth Katamore, Professor Ruth Katamore, who is our senior director responsible for the development of the index. I think if I may, I'd just like to give her a minute or two to, I suppose, make a pitch as to why we think this amalgamation is not only necessary, but it's actually possible. Ruth.
See, I'm supposed to do the wrap up, so maybe I'll let High Commissioner Webson then I'll add on SG to what you were saying. High Commissioner Webson, over to you. You're on mute, sir.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, I'm saying we do have Dr. Ruth to do a wrap up, so we will certainly love to hear from you. I think this discussion continues to be very rich and continues to be moving us towards a closer reach and agreement on what we need. There's a consensus that's building. A few weeks ago, we held the AOSIS group held about 3 different meetings, and where we had the opportunity to look at and discuss 4 or 5 of these indices. And we couldn't agree more with the statements of both Dr. Stewart, Assistant Secretary Harris, and Baroness Scotland, that we now are getting closer and we need to hone in on what it is we need it for and what is it going to contain. And the small island states are ready. We need to establish a platform where we can draw some closure so that we can take the next step. And we hope over the next several months to get there. We have another discussion of this kind on Monday, which would be another index to look at. And I think, as I said, we are beginning to build some consensus. Dr. Ruth Katamore will close us and will give us some further guidance on the Commonwealth's Universal Index. And we will again put that together with those that we are continuing to hear from, because we are determined as small states at the United Nations to draw some conclusion and draw a line so we can move forward. And that's why this is such an extensive discussion that is taking place over these last, 12 months, 15 months, as we attempt to work. The Secretary General is going to make his recommendations later this year. Our responsible committee will then take action on it, and we hope we will be able to reach a point of next steps for implementation. And we are putting together the kind of advocacy that is necessary. And we know that that's one of the steps, but we got to put the toolbox completely together so that we do not wait another 20 years or even another 2 years, but we could find some common ground very, very, very soon. Dr. Kerry Murray, you have the floor to wrap it up, please.
Thank you. Thank you, High Commissioner Webson. And I also want to thank you especially
By
for
the way,
your...
it's Ambassador and not High Commissioner.
Oh, sorry, Ambassador Ambassador Webson, thank you for your leadership in this conversation. And I think that's very important. So let me start by thanking the Secretary General, who has been committed to this issue from the very beginning that she became the Secretary General. And that is because of her understanding of how this is such an important issue. Now, I'll briefly give a little bit more elaboration on the Commonwealth Secretariat's current 2021 framework of the Vulnerability Index. So what we've tried to do is looked at structural and non-structural resilience along with vulnerability. And I think firstly, not only is it multidimensional, it is multidimensional because we need to understand and we need to have a framework which is comprehensive and we can always disaggregate if necessary. And secondly, we are looking at vulnerabilities alongside resilience because and also examining resilience as in what is the country's resilience, both structural and non-structural, to be able to tackle some of the pressures that they are under. And I think that is the speciality in the index that we have tried to bring out now. But what are the point of these indices? And we've had such an enriching conversation today. What is the purpose of these indices? And also thanks to SG and to Honorable Chad Green, who had participated in an earlier conversation today as well. And that's the important thing, as in we are united in this. And I also believe the timing is excellent because we have learned from, one point I want to make is that we look at vulnerability and resilience, but we have to look at things alongside debt management as well, because that's another big issue that how do countries, what are the pressures that countries are in financially? And this is where the Secretariat, we are trying to combine this work at the Secretariat as well to look at it alongside debt management of countries. Now, I liked what Mr. Elliot Green was talking about, and he highlighted how the small size of domestic markets itself makes them, and the need makes them really needy for external finance. And I think that's a very important point. And the fact that that actually is a deterrent for private financing, is a constraint for private financing, and therefore public finance is very important. Now, this morning I was thinking about this, and the sentence that came to my mind was, the economies of small states are disproportionately disadvantaged. And I think that's the key thing that unites us. The fact is that small states are disproportionately constrained because of the size of their economies, and they're disadvantaged because of the extremity of their vulnerabilities to climate change. And that is what makes this argument so powerful, and the timing so important. And I also want to refer to Stuart's, my friend Young Stuart's great work that he's been doing and the presentation that he did. And the point is about, we now have to move forward about finding innovative financing mechanisms. And he's already started looking at some of the modeling that he showed us. And that is the way, that is what we need to be thinking about. And the purpose of today's conversation is that we do have informally the vulnerability indices being looked at, but how do we move forward to take it more formally forward and find innovative financing mechanisms? And that should include, that's where I'm saying debt management, looking at the model that we have tried to put together at the Secretariat of the Vulnerability. All these things have to come together in our trying to find innovative models of financing, combining public and private sector funding? How do we incentivize private sectors, or how do we encourage, what would encourage private financing to invest? Is it regional coordination? And already there are examples of the Caribbean where there is a close regional cooperation, be it in terms of access to vaccines in the recent crisis, how they shared whatever vaccines were given to the Caribbean region. Instead of taking it as one country, they tried to distribute it equally in the Caribbean. So I would close just by saying that these are examples. Today, the 2 meetings we've had and the ongoing conversation is the important thing is we are united. We are strong in the fact that we are being united. We've heard about how for 30 years, the Secretariat itself has been working on vulnerability indices for at least 30 years. So this is, firstly, we are united in a common cause because it is irrelevant and it's an important and it's absolutely crucial. And I've heard everyone say we should do it immediately. And I use the phrase, we should have been doing it yesterday. So today is already too late. So action, what do we do to move forward rapidly? And I also think we have a great opportunity because we have learned from COVID that we have become, things are irreversible. Where we have been are no longer valid. Where we go forward now is what is very important. And this is an example of how do we come together, that we go forward together to have a more equitable processes. And in this case, access to finance, where there's vulnerability is high and where resilience is low. How do we enable, and how do we enable countries which are disproportionately disadvantaged to be fairly, to have access to just and fair access to the financing needs that they have. And I want to thank the government of Antigua and Barbuda for collaborating and partnering with us in this, and all of you, SG, Mr. Harris, and Stuart, thank you for the great work that you're doing. And lastly, but not the least, I want to mention Tumasi Blair from the Mission of Antigua and Barbuda to the UN, and Travis Michel, my colleague and my collaborator in the Commonwealth Vulnerability Index, and Anya Thomas. We have a friend in Anya who's at the 6th unit of UN VISA, who've been working very hard behind the scenes to put this together. So thank you all very much, and have a lovely rest of the evening and a great weekend. And do not miss this one small matter of a big match on Sunday. The Euro 2020. So have a good weekend, everybody, and thank you. The more we talk, I mean, I think this is timing is when people are ready to be hearing this, and how can we work together to move forward. So thank you and be safe. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks all. Be safe. Have a good weekend.
55.